Well, good evening, my friends. And hello to everybody at home. We're getting ready for the cool weather tonight. God bless those folks up north, all that snow. We can take a couple days of cold weather. That's as far as we want to go, right? So tonight, tonight is sort of a little juicy topic tonight, with the seven deadly sins. And, this is not to say that there are, only seven sins, of course. But as we'll see, so many of the sins, and this is from the discernment of the church over the centuries, so many sins flow from these. And these become the major categories, if you will, and as we'll talk about, all sins that we commit pretty much fall into one of these kind of categories. And we'll augment this next week with the Ten Commandments. So we're starting to get into the moral law a little bit, and then after that we'll return to the sacrament of reconciliation. Once I teach about the sins and the commandments, and I'll tell you how to get absolution for any things that you've broken here, right? So then we'll do that. And we're kind of coming into the home stretch of the course. We're getting ready to start Lent in a couple of weeks. Ash Wednesday is 2 weeks from Wednesday. So we're getting in, and that's kind of our signal that we're approaching the end, of this. And the term of your suffering, much like purgatory, will come to an end. So let's begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O ineffable Creator, true source of light and wisdom, origin of all things, be pleased to cast a beam of your radiance upon the darkness of my mind. Take from me the double darkness of sin and ignorance in which I was born. Give me quickness of understanding, a retentive memory, the ability to grasp things correctly and fundamentally, and abundant grace of expression. Order the beginning, direct the progress, and perfect the achievement of my work. You who are true God and true man, and who live and reign forever and ever. Amen. So we have this relationship, with the Lord that we talk about, and sin is a damaging of that relationship. That's one way to think about. That's one way to think about sin, right? In kind of a layman's terms. We'll talk theological stuff tonight, but then there's also some layman's terms that we kind of get into. Well, first of all, what is sin? From the etymology of the word sin, it's from an Old English word which means to incur guilt. That's what that word from the language means. Theologically, very simple. Sin is an offense against God, and as we'll see, a privation of grace, a lacking, a denial, a rejection, if you will, of grace. And as we'll see, all of our sins are, if for it to be a sin, it's something that we have to truly and freely choose. So we're, in this sense, rejecting the grace of God, right? Sin is nothing else than a morally bad act, right? An act not in accord with reason that's informed by the divine law. This is a huge point. We won't spend a whole lot of time on this one tonight, but the moral life is a life that is in congruity, consistency with reason, right? It's not just blind obedience. It's with reason, right? We understand God's law. We believe through faith that God is leading us to Him through His holy laws. And as we'll see in a little while, the scriptural approach to God's law was a little bit different from our approach. But it's a morally bad act, an act not in accord with reason that's informed by divine grace. So again, some different definitions. An offense against God, an offense against reason and truth and right conscience. I'll return to this shortly, but That conscience must be well formed according to the law of God. Come back to that in a few moments. So an offense against reason, against truth, against right conscience, a failure of genuine love of God and of neighbor, as we've seen, I touched on yesterday in the Sunday homily. The greatest commandment of the Lord is to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves, and that's the entire moral life. And so a sin is a failure to love God and to love our neighbor. A sin that sets us against God's love for us and turns our hearts away from it, right? By a free act, we say no to following the Lord's law. I'm going to review here something that we talked about back in the beginning in creation and the fall of man, how sin is an abuse of our free will. We talked about before in the parable of the naughty teenager, you might remember, how you give your teenage son $20 and the keys to your car, and you say go to Publix and get some milk and come back, and he goes down, gets his friends and goes down to the beach to look at girls, right? And you say, well, now, was he free and to do that? And we understand, no, he's free, meaning he truly is free, right? We're not going with him. We're not forcing him to turn into Publix. We're not making him go to the dairy section, right? Right? We're letting him go. He's free, but he's free to do what he is told to do. He's not free to go to the beach and look at girls, right? To do that would be an abuse of his freedom. It's a very interesting concept, and somewhat at odds, we said, with our sort of American understanding of freedom. We do whatever we want, right? And indeed, in the moral law, that's not what we're talking about. That is what we call license, right? As the old 60s song said, remember, I'm free to do what I want any old time, right? The Rolling Stones. Or you got to go where you want to go, do what you want to do with whoever you want to do it with. Mamas and the papas, right? That's the 60s version of freedom, and the church will say, no, that's not freedom. That attitude, that's what we call license, right? An abuse of our free will. As we talked about before, John Paul II put together, I just thought, the greatest definition of moral freedom that there is. He said, freedom consists not in doing what we like, but in having the right to do what we ought. Right? So that teenage son has the right to do what he ought to do. He has the right. Right? Like again, we're not forcing him. We're not making him go. He has the right to go to Publix and get some milk. Right? He has that right. He does not have the right to do what he likes and go to the beach and look at girls. Right? So freedom consists not in doing what we like, but in having the freedom to do, or the right to do, what we ought. So we're not puppets on a string. God is not forcing us to act in a certain way. We're truly free. And this definition, of course, presupposes that there is a higher authority who determines what that ought is. And that is, of course, God. And this will be another thing when we get into the deadly sin, particularly the deadly sin of pride, right? That it is God who is the higher authority who determines what is the ought. Just as in that little parable, it's the parents who determine what you ought to do, what you are free to do. Your mom or your dad is the one that tells you what you are free to do, right? Not yourself, right? So as we said, sin is primarily a privation of the good, a lack, a twisting of something good, or a disordering of the will in which an evil, or sometimes a lesser good, is sought over the highest good, which is God. Let me break down those three things, because each one of those is good. A privation of the good. Sometimes an act is just purely evil. Murder on one extreme, there's nothing good about that, right? Premeditated murder or something, armed robbery, right? It's just evil, an evil act. Sometimes it's a twisting of something that is good. Fornication, good example of that. The marital act, should we say, the conjugal act is a good thing. God created it to be good. But when we take something good and then twist it, now we're doing it in a way that God does not allow us to do. We're taking something good and we've now twisted it into something evil, right? To commit a sin. Or sometimes we choose an evil or a lesser good instead of God. What might be an example of that? A beautiful Sunday morning, you wake up, and it's such a great day, I think I'm going to go to the beach. And you go, that's great. Going to the beach is great. And God made the beach. It's good. And going to the beach is good. On a beautiful day, God made that too. But when you say, I'm going to go to the beach, and I'm not going to go to Mass. Now, you see what I've done. Have taken a lesser good and preferred it over a higher good, which is my proper worship of God, right? So, hey, go to the vigil mass the night before, and then go to the beach all you want, right? But it's when we choose a lesser good over the higher good, all right? These are all ideas of sin here, right? Whether just choosing something completely evil, or twisting something that's good, or even just choosing a lesser good in place of a higher good, right? As death, as from the Catholic Encyclopedia, as death is the privation of the principle of life, all right? The death of the soul is the privation of sanctifying grace, which is the principle of supernatural life. Sanctifying grace, the presence of God within us, who lives within us, within the soul, who is turned toward him. And when we commit a sin, in a particular way, a grievous sin, we kick God out of us. All right? We turn our back on him. Right? And that puts us in grave danger. Right? So though we can sin against our neighbor, of course, every sin is committed directly and immediately against God. As the psalm says, against you, you alone have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. Now, we can classify sins a lot of different ways. They can be sins of commission or sins of omission. In other words, things that I do and things that I did not do but should have done. You remember, if you come to Mass on Sunday and we do the penitential rite at the beginning, in my thoughts and in my words, and what I have done and in what I have failed to do, acts of sins of commission and sins of omission. All right. What might be, and sins of omission? An easy one is I just decide, not going to go to Mass on Sunday. Right. I am a sin of omission. Right. Sin of commission is doing something, an active, if you will, choice to commit a sin, rather than an active choice to do something that I should do, or I should say, an active choice not to do something that I should do. Right? Sins can be against God or against man. It said, though, ultimately every sin is directly against God. Sins can be spiritual or carnal. And we'll talk about those when we get to the 7 deadly sins. However we classified it, as Jesus said, the root of all sin is a perverted will in the heart of man. Perverted, twisted, right? The will reaches out and moves us towards something that is against the will of God, right? And says, yeah, I want that, go get it. That's the twisted will in which we prefer something else besides God, right? As Jesus said, out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witness, slander. Those are what defile us. And keep in mind that nothing external from us can cause us to sin, right? It says the root of all sin is the perverted will in the heart of man. So nothing external to us can cause us to sin. It can tempt us to sin, but it can't cause us to sin. Why not? Because if something forces us to sin, then we are not freely choosing it, right? So it has to be a free choice in order for it to be a sin. So nothing outside of us can force us, cause us to sin. It can tempt us, though, right? The devil never makes you do it, right? Okay? The devil can tempt you to do it, but never makes you do it. If the devil makes you do it, then you are not responsible for it. Right? Touching again on something we hit on before, of a mortal sin or a grave sin sometimes. Tradition defines a mortal sin as a sin that destroys the charity in the heart of man due to what? A grave violation of God's law. That is, it destroys that sanctifying grace, the presence of God, right? The friendship with God necessary for eternal salvation, and therefore putting our souls at risk. And if we're ever in the unfortunate position to be in a state of mortal sin, we should repent of it immediately, correct the mistake that we've made, go to confession, as we'll talk about in a couple weeks. And as we mentioned, the church, there are 3 criteria for determining if a sin is mortal or not. These are broad categories. And it's going to be hard for me to say, there are extremes that are sure, those are grave mortal sin. And there are some that, again, as we'll see, are more difficult to define. But criteria, it has to be a grave matter, in other words. It has to be an important thing. Does it violate one of the moral precepts, for example, in the 10 Commandments, or the grave vices? 2, you have to have full knowledge. The sinner understands that the action is an objectively evil act. You have to know it's a sin, in other words, a grave sin. And you have to give it complete consent. Did the person commit sin freely, or was he under constraint? Nota bene, feigned ignorance or hardness of heart do not diminish, but rather increase the voluntary nature of sin, right? So all of those 3, grave matter, full knowledge, complete consent, have to be present for a mortal sin to be committed. If any of them if any one of them is lacking, it's not a mortal sin. It may be sinful, but it's not a mortal sin, right? Now, there are certain circumstances and unintentional ignorance that can diminish or even remove the guilt of offense. Though none of us is deemed ignorant of the moral law, by the Lord, we kind of have it within us that it's wrong to kill somebody, it's wrong to steal from somebody. These are the basic things. We understand that. No one is deemed ignorant of those things. And I'll throw you a little deeper theology here. We will distinguish between the Latin word is the malum, the objective evil committed, the act itself, right? Textbook act, and the culpa, the subjective level of responsibility that we incur by the sinner. So for example, you can commit a malum without incurring the culpa if there is ignorance or some other mitigating factor, right? In a mortal sin, the sinner is guilty of both the malum and the culpa. So in other words, there is an objectively evil act that you have responsibility for. If, for example, you are they strap a bomb to you, right? And they say, all right, you got to go in there and rob this bank or I'm going to detonate the bomb, right? Okay. So you go in there, you rob the bank, you come out, they take the bomb off you and they go away. Have you committed you committed armed robbery? So is that an objective evil act? Yes. So you have committed a malum, right? That is textbook definition. Robbing a bank is an evil act. Do you have the culpa? Do you have the subjective responsibility for doing it? You could argue, no, you don't, because you were forced to do it, right? Crazy example, but you get the point, right? So in addition to mortal sin, the big one, right, there's what we call venial sin, right? Venial sin weakens charity. In other words, it doesn't destroy the charity, it weakens it, though. It manifests a disordered affection for created goods. Created goods are great, and it's fine to have an affection for created goods, but not a disordered one. Right? Venial sin impedes our progress in the exercise of the virtues, the practices of the moral good. It merits temporal punishment, as we said last week, purgatory. And as we talked about, before, there's seldom a mortal sin that didn't first begin as a venial sin, right? Deliberate and unrepentant venial sin disposes us little by little to commit mortal sin. But it does not put us in direct opposition to the will and friendship of God. It does not break our covenant. It does not kick God out. We don't turn our back on God by venial sin. And with God's grace, it is humanly reparable. Right? We can repair this. We can correct these things. St. Augustine said this back in the 5th century. He said, while he is in the flesh, man cannot help but have at least some light sins. But do not ignore these sins which we call light. Light when you weigh them, tremble when you count them up. Our hope, above all, confession, a point to which we will return. Right? Now you've heard I'm not a lawyer, but you've heard in the legal world of being an accessory to a crime, right? You're kind of like helping, right? You didn't rob the bank, but you're driving the getaway car, right? You're an accessory to the robbery, right? In the same way, we can be an accessory to sin and bear the guilt of sin as well. So in addition to the sins we ourselves commit, either by act or omission, tradition teaches us that we can be guilty of sin by being an accessory to another person's sin. In fact, there are 9 ways in which we can be guilty for another's sin. Let me explain them. By counsel. Glenn, you should commit this sin. Right? You should skip Mass this Sunday. Come with us to the beach. Right? I'm counseling him to sin. Right? I'm an accessory to it. That's a sinful act for me to do. Right? By command. Glenn, skip Mass this Sunday. Go to the beach. Right? By consent. Yes, Glenn, you can commit that sin and go to the beach. I'm consenting to it. Right? By provocation. Hey, Glenn, I dare you. You won't skip Mass this week and go to the beach, right? I'm provoking him, right? By praise or flattery. Glenn, it was so cool that you skipped Mass this week and went to the beach. Give that to Father Zerilli, right? Yeah, all right. By concealment. All right, Glenn, I won't tell anybody that you committed that sin. Right? Even though I should say something, but in other words, we're covering up a sin if we didn't. And this gets into, we want to be very clear about what this one means. If Sally is dating Timmy, right? They break up, and then now Timmy starts dating Annie. Well, Sally doesn't like it and kills Timmy, right? And they blame it on Annie. But you saw the whole thing. You have to say something, right? You can't conceal it, right? You're morally obligated to say something. You can't conceal, cover. I just won't say anything, Annie, okay? I just won't say anything, right? You can be an accessory to sin by partaking of it. Hey, Glenn, I'll go with you to the beach this Sunday. I'll leave these guys, I don't need to go. I'll go with you and skip at Mass, right? By silence. I won't say anything about this sin even though I should. Similar to the other one, right? And by defense of the ill done. What else could you have done? You were right to commit that. It was a beautiful day that Sunday. Well, you were right to go and do that, right? So those are all ways in which we participate, if you will, and bear the guilt of sin committed by another. Let me pause and explain a little bit more about conscience. I've spoken about this a few times in the bulletin, sometimes in homilies, but this is an important thing, and I think this is one area of moral theology that confuses a lot of people, and that the popular culture has the wrong idea about, right? It's our conscience. So this is from the Second Vatican Council. Deep within his conscience, man discovers a law which he has not laid upon himself, but which he must obey. Its voice, ever calling him to love and to do what is good and to avoid evil, sounds in his heart at the right moment. For man has in his heart a law inscribed by God. His conscience is man's most secret core and his sanctuary. There he is alone with God, whose voice echoes in his depths. Our conscience is present in the heart of every person, instructing us at the right moment to do good and to reject evil, right? It judges particular choices and recognizes the moral quality of a concrete act. All right, I'm about to do this concrete act. I will recognize in that act, my conscience tells me it is morally good or morally evil, right? It approves those that are good and denounces those that are evil. We are obliged to follow faithfully what we know to be just and right. However, it's important to remember that our conscience is not a law unto itself. Right? We do not make judgments as to what is good or evil. In other words, God alone does that. It's such a beautiful day on Sunday, I'm just going to miss Mass. It's not that big of a deal because it's such a pretty day. No? And I, in my conscience, feel that that's okay. Miss it. Really? Well, isn't that nice, right? That you feel that it's okay to miss Mass because it's a pretty day. Isn't that wonderful that you feel that way, right? That God alone determines what is good or evil, right? We don't make judgments as to that. We have before us now an act. I'm going to skip Mass on Sunday and go to the beach. And our conscience analyzes that, judges it as either good or evil, and then compels us to do one or the other, to do the good or avoid the evil. And we must obey it, but it's not a law unto itself. The role of the conscience is to apply the moral law, not to create it. That's huge, right? And our conscience can never lead us to commit a sin. Right there, right? Well, in my conscience, I thought it was okay to skip Mass and go, Your conscience can never lead you to commit a sin, right? So we have a grave duty to educate our conscience, right? Not according to the standards of the world or our own passions, right? They are way different from the kingdom of God, but rather according to the mind of Christ and to the teachings of the church which he founded to bring us to him. The gospel is not to be taken as simply suggestions, or as we'll say next week, not the 10 suggestions, right? It's 10 commandments that we can accept in one hand or accept in part or reject, right? Accept them all. And God's law, rather, is to be gratefully received as a gift from God, who desires us to know his heart and his will. As I mentioned earlier, there's this attitude in the scriptures of the Old Testament about God's law, and it's perfectly summed up here in Psalm 19. I mean, listen to the praise of this, right? The law of the Lord is perfect. It refreshes the soul. The decree of the Lord is trustworthy, giving wisdom to the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The command of the Lord is clear, enlightening the eye. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The statutes of the Lord are true, and all of them just. They are more desirable than gold and sweeter than honey. Gives you an idea that the law of God, that he calls us around which we are, or upon which we're to build our conscience and form our conscience. These are not burdens. Look at how the ancient peoples looked at God's law. Perfect, as refreshing, right? As trustworthy, as wise, as rejoicing and enlightening, and all of these wonderful things. Why? Because it revealed the mind and heart of God. And through faith, we know that fulfilling God's law will lead us to him, which is our highest good. And we also know that fulfilling God's law will ultimately lead us to happiness in this life and certainly eternal happiness in the next. That's why it's always in accord with reason as well. So we form our consciences according to the law of God and not the law, the standards of the world, or our own passions, right? So the greatest commandment, as we mentioned earlier, is to love God and love our neighbor, to be totally outward oriented. Now, if you notice, right, the love of God and love of neighbor. You know, see where that's where my emphasis is, and I preach on this a lot because I love this part. The whole orientation of the Christian person is directed outward to love of God and love of neighbor, right? St. Augustine called sin a state of being caved in on oneself with our focus radically inward. See the difference, right? Instead of God and neighbor, I'm focused on me, right? cut ourselves off from God and neighbor. We exalt ourselves to an inordinate degree. We make ourselves into gods, if you will. The problem is, we're not God or a God, right? And exalting ourselves above God is contrary to reason because we're not God. And it's contrary to the order of nature. God is our creator and the source of life. So cutting ourselves off from God through sin means that we're eventually going to collapse inward in our own self, right? Caved in on ourselves, we're not alive. In a figurative sense, we're dead, right? That's why they call them the deadly sins, right? As we'll talk about. Because we're not oriented out toward love of God and love of neighbor, right? I'm radically focused and collapsed on myself and on the exaltation of myself and on the what's what I want and totally forgetting everything about God and neighbor, but rather only focusing on myself. And in that sense, we're not alive, we're dead in the spiritual sense. And I mentioned my favorite literary character. I brought him up a few weeks ago on Sunday Mass. This book is such an allegory of the Christian faith in so many ways. You should do an analysis of it. Read the book and read the book through the lens of your Catholic faith, and you'll see so many elements of it there that reveal so many of the spiritual truths that we study. But there's a scene, and they do this in every movie that they make about A Christmas Carol. There's a scene toward the beginning of the movie or the book. This is after we're introduced to Scrooge, and after he rejects going to see his nephew Fred, and after he yells at Cratchit for being late, and after he refuses to give any charity to the two guys that come and ask him for alms for the poor, and all of these things. And we just introduce him. He's just a nasty human being, right? And he goes into his room Christmas Eve, right? And he's sitting by the fire, and he lights the tiniest little bit of coal, right? And it's freezing outside, and he's bundled up, it's dark. And he's bundled up, and he's got his little cup of soup or whatever he's eating. And it's the picture of a man caved in on himself, right? He's dead to everyone, right? The charity, the love of God, the love of neighbor, even his love of his family, anything that he's doing, he's rather caved in on himself. And that little picture of him in his rooms, locked in there in the cold, huddled up against this meager little fire and eating this little bit of porridge or whatever he's got, is a perfect picture of that. Dead. And that's why they call him the deadly sins, this idea of being collapsed in a heap of self-centeredness, right? So down through the centuries, Holy Mother Church, which is really the greatest teacher and student of human nature, has the certain ways in which we cave in ourselves, right? Cutting ourselves off from love of God and love of neighbor. And she's called those the 7 deadly sins, right? And every sin, in a sense, every other sin derives from these 7, as we said. They're deadly because they kill the soul. They destroy our relationship with God. The sanctifying grace of our baptism, needed for eternal salvation, cut us off from neighbor as well. Right? Saint Athanasius, and this is a great quote from the 4th century, said, "The glory of God is man fully alive." He wants us to be alive in this life, and certainly for the next. Begin to live the life of heaven now, outwardly open toward love of God and love of neighbor. That's what heaven will be. There'll be no selfishness in heaven, right? Everything is outward toward the other. And that's what God wants, and that is the fullness of his glory, is seeing his creation fully alive. But the 7 deadly sins wrap us up. They kill us in a collapsing heap of self-centeredness, and they prevent us from being alive in the way that God calls us to be. So what are the 7 deadly sins, right? I'll give them to you in the traditional order of gravity, meaning the worst is first, right? And then we go from there. The 7 deadly sins: pride, envy, wrath, sloth or acedia, greed or avarice, gluttony, and lust. Now, interesting, as I said, the worst is the first. So pride is the worst one of all. That doesn't mean that, lust is not so bad, right? They're all 7 deadly sins, but this is the traditional order, and you notice these first 5 are the spiritual sins. These last 2 are the carnal sins, the corporal sins. And why are they're last on that list, by the way, not because they're not so bad. They're last on the list because gluttony and lust are the easiest to overcome of all of them on that list, right? Because they're at the level of the flesh, right? It's the level of the spirit that's a lot harder. Now, all the deadly sins have one thing in common. Again, they're radically turned inward toward the self, away from God and away from others, as we're going to see. Remember what Jesus taught here. If anyone wishes to come after me, deny yourself, right? In other words, stop being so caved in on yourself, right? Deny yourself. Don't turn into yourself. Deny yourself. Take up your cross daily and follow me. Whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. Whoever's forgetting himself, in other words, losing his life, right? Forgetting, not thinking about himself. He's thinking about God. He's thinking about others. And that radically outward orientation, right? Ironically, in losing your life that way, that's when you save it, right? It's giving yourself away that you find it, right? And that's the great challenge, the great glory of the gospel. And, of course, carried out by Jesus himself upon the cross. What did he do on the cross? Giving himself totally to God in obedience out of love for man. He's focused on God and neighbor. And did he lost his life? Yeah. But then he found it, right? Through the resurrection. Right? He also said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. There's that outward orientation. So we note the difference. Again, the deadly sins are turned inward. The gospel is radically turned outward toward God and toward others. I'm going to use as a little bit of an image here to help us walk through the 7 deadly sins, Dante's Purgatory. Now, you've all heard, this is the second of 3 parts of Dante's masterpiece, The Divine Comedy. Everyone's heard of Dante's Inferno. That's the first part, right? And the second part is Purgatory. The third part is Paradise. And in it, the author is kind of given a guided tour, first of hell, and then through Purgatory, and through heaven. It's a fantastic book. As I like to say, it's about that thick. And, and it's a bit of a slog to get through. You really kind of need a study manual as you're going through it, or some footnotes or something. But it's one of the absolute masterpieces of Western literature in the 14th century, and still being studied today in a profound way. As I like to say, you'll read Dante's Inferno and you will run to confession. I promise you that. But anyway, so he envisions purgatory as a 7-tiered mountain. All these images I'm going to talk about, these are fiction, right? These are ideas of Dante, right? But it gives us but it's a very good image, so I'm going to use it. He envisions purgatory as a 7-tiered mountain, each level corresponding to one of the 7 deadly sins. And the author's given a tour of purgatory, and we see how the poor souls are purged of their sinfulness at each level. And we're going to follow along. So I've included here a little bit of a drawing that's in one of the books about Dante's Purgatory of the 7-tiered mountain. There's a bunch of other stuff here we don't have to worry about. And you come in here, and here at the lowest level is the proud, right? Then envy, wrath, sloth, avarice, gluttony, and lust at the top. And then you get there, and in paradise, and then you go, the earthly paradise, and then you go from there. There's a whole bunch more to talk about, but this isn't a course on Dante's Purgatory, but it's a good image to help us deal with the 7 deadly sins. So let's talk about the first one. Pride. The deadliest of the deadly sins, right? It was the first sin of Adam and Eve, by which evil entered into the world, and it was the sin of the devil, right? It is the exaltation of the self in its most potent form. Exaltation of the self, right? I'm not talking about here psychological pride or the satisfaction that you get from doing something well, or your kids, I'm so proud of you. That's not what we're talking about, right? Rather, pride, the spiritual sin of pride, is in essence turning oneself into God. Now, we don't say it that way, we don't use that language, we don't think we're doing that, right? But that's essentially what we're doing in its most potent form. Pride is claiming for oneself God's unique right to determine what is right and wrong, good and evil. Right? We say, I'll decide what's right and wrong, good and evil, instead of God, right? Refusing to submit in humility to the holy laws and will of the Creator. Right? This is beautifully written about here in the book of Genesis, the fall of man. This is chapter 3 of 2 and 3 of the book of Genesis. You'll recall that God put Adam and Eve in a beautiful garden, and he gave them he said, what? You are free. He told them what you're free to do, right? Just like you tell the teenage kid, you're free to go to Publix, get the milk, and come back. You are free to eat the fruit of any of the trees that you see in this garden, except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the one in the middle there. You are not free to eat of that fruit. Now, we'll talk about what that means in a moment. Just like we were to say to your teenager, you are free to go to Publix. You are not free to go to the beach and look at girls, okay? Right. That tree in the middle of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, represents God's unique prerogative to determine right and wrong. He's God, right? He gets to decide that, right? It's a fringe benefit of being God. You get to determine what's right and wrong, what's good and evil. And that tree is a symbol of that right. Right? And God told him, you may not eat of that tree. In other words, you may not determine what is right and wrong. Okay? To take the fruit is to usurp God's prerogative, to claim that right for themselves. In essence, to try and deify themselves. No. Well, that's what God does. Well, no, I want to do that. I want to decide what's right and wrong for me. Right? And that's where you become God, right? It's an abuse of their freedom, right? They were not free to eat that fruit. In other words, they were not free to determine good and evil. So their attitude was, I'll decide what to do. I'll determine what is right. I am the arbiter of good and evil. I will take to myself the prerogative to decide because I'm free, supposedly, right? I will eat that fruit, therefore. I'm God, right? That's the procession, right? That's the whole idea. Summed up by that image of that tree. And when they decided to do that, they committed the sin of pride, right? It's the exaltation of the self over and above God is the mother of all sins, right? It's the big one. As Dante was walking through purgatory, through his guided tour, he came across on that first level the proud and how they were suffering in purgatory, how they were being purged of that sin. And we have a few illustrations from that. Again, these are fiction, right, meant to make a point. But this is how the proud in Dante's Purgatory suffer. I don't know how good it's going to come out on this screen. Pretty good. But see, there's Dante there, and there's his tour guide, Virgil. And these are the proud. They're suffering in purgatory. And you notice they're carrying big giant rocks on their backs. And the idea is that if you're proud, you're puffing yourself up, what do the rocks make you do? Bow. In humility, right? That's the idea. I love it, right? Some of these images, by the way, are a little graphic, but I think you can handle them. But what a great image, right, for the idea of how we counter the sin of pride, right? with the virtues of life. What's the antidote? It's humility. Humility comes from the Latin word humus, which means dust or earth, right? At its root, humility means recognizing that we are not God. We are dust, right? That's what humility means. It comes from the root word of meaning dust. To say that to be a humble person before God, meaning I don't have that right to determine good and evil. I'm the creature. I'm not the creator. I'm not God. The proud says, I am God. But the humble one says, no, I'm not. I'm dust. Right? Remember the admonition we receive on Ash Wednesday coming up. Remember, man, that you are dust, and unto dust you will return. And we get that little bit of ashes. It's a reminder that we're dust, right? Beloved dust. And one of the great spiritual reflections during Lent especially is to say, is to realize during Lent, especially as we and into Holy Week, I am dust, I'm nothing, and yet God sent his Son to take on the flesh that I have as human flesh and came to die so that I could share in his life. Me, I who am dust, right? He loves us that much, cares for us, desires us that deeply, right? That for the dust that we are, he sent his Son, right? Amazing. The antidotes, humility, and I also put here frequent recourse to prayer and the sacrament, right? In prayer, we recognize our status before our Creator humbly. That's why we kneel. Why do you think we kneel when we come to Mass? One of the reasons, right? We kneel humbly before God, right? Humbly offering him our thanks. We beseech his mercy. We make known to him our needs and intentions. Of course, he already knows them, but he asks us to make them known. So we ourselves need to speak them. He needs to hear them. We need to beseech him as a supplicant before the Lord. We need to humble ourselves before him, right? In the sacraments, especially the Mass, we go to God and worship, right? As the source of life and all that is. He's the source, not us. He's the creator, not us. We worship him, not the other way around, right? And particularly in confession, we acknowledge and repent of our violations of his holy laws that we have decided to take to change around, right? Asking him humbly for mercy and for help, right? So that's the great sin of pride. There's much, much more to go into each one, but I'm going to kind of hit each one sort of briefly just to give an overview. But there's so much more in the moral life to talk about, and it's for me, I think it's wonderful, very interesting stuff. I don't know about you, but the next one is envy. This is another big one, right? We're still at the bottom of the mountain, right? And you would think some of the other ones might be worse than envy, but the church has always said, no, envy's the closest kind of cousin, right, to pride, and we'll see why. According to St. Thomas Aquinas, envy is defined, get this, as sorrow at another person's good fortune or possessions. I'm sad because of what someone else has or because of the good fortune of another, right? It's different from jealousy, which is an inordinate attachment to one's own possessions, right? Or a fear of sadness that they might be lost. Envy is the sorrow at another's good fortune or their possessions, right? The closest daughter to pride, right? What's the attitude of envy? It should be mine, right? The honor should come to me. If you have something, that means that I don't, and I want it. And you're not better than I am, all that stuff, right? Notice where the focus is. It's not on God, it's not on neighbor. It's radically turned inward, right? It's on me, because I'm sad because of what you have, all those things, right? And it gets worse. Envy gets worse. Envy also includes rejoicing at the downfall of another, right? If something goes bad for a neighbor, then I somehow feel better, right? So you're having breakfast one Saturday morning, and you look out the window, and your neighbor's house across the street, and they got a brand new car in the front yard. And what's your thought? Well, so-and-so got a brand new car. Isn't that nice? You know? Envy, right? Oh, look what they got. You know? Whatever. A week later, you look out the window again, and a windy night like this, a tree fell on their new car. And you go, ha! Look what happened. Hey, honey, come here, look at this, right? So what is that, right? It's sorrow at another's good fortune, joy at another's downfall. God help us, right? What's the matter with us when we that way, right? Isn't that awful? But that's envy, right? Again, notice how envy is self-referential, referring only to the self, right? And self-reverential, it reveres the self. It's what I should have. It's what I want, right? Everything is in reference to the self. Everything about how it affects me and my own sense of worth. Man, it's deadly, right? You can see how that will eat at you. That'll kill you, right? Spiritually, right? If that's let to fester, right? What's the antidote to this? Because that's a big one. Remembering that your worth comes from God and not your possessions. You are dust, but beloved dust. You look at that crucifix and you say, God did that for me. We read last week in the book of Hebrews. It's a striking thing. I didn't have a chance to preach on it, but I should have. Where the author to Hebrews praises the early Christians of the first century, where they, because of their faith, that the authorities came and took everything that they have, and the author says, and you rejoiced at the confiscation of your own property. Why? Because I know I have an eternal property, if you will, in heaven, right? The idea that I know who I am in the eyes of God, and that is the one by whom I am judged. That is the one who gives me my worth and my value, not the things that I possess. And so if I have something or don't, it changes nothing in the love that God has for me, right? That's what we got to remember. And pray for the grace to admire God's gifts and blessings in others, right? How do the envious suffer in Dante's Purgatory? This is funny, a little graphic. Kind of hard to make out here, but there's Dante and his guide there, and these are the envious, right? And you can't quite make it out, but their eyes are sewn shut, right? And you say, well, why that? So that they can't look around to see what everybody else has, right? Their eyes are sewn shut, right? The next one, wrath, another big one. Wrath is defined as the unreasonable, immoderate desire for vengeance or to inflict evil upon someone, okay? We can use this from anger. Often we use those two interchangeably. We'll make a slight, and sometimes you'll hear it as the deadly sin of anger, and that's fine. But I call it wrath to distinguish it from anger, right? We can legitimately be angry about a lot of things, but wrath is unreasonable and immoderate, okay? So we are somehow harmed, whether in truth or in perception, right? We are somehow harmed, and then our desire becomes to return that harm, but not in an equal way, right? It starts on the playground. You're sitting in the playground, and Glenn throws, we're in kindergarten, Glenn throws a handful of sand in my face, in the sandbox, right? So what do? Well, I'm going to throw a handful of sand back in his face. But do I do the same amount of sand with the same amount of force? Or do I get a whole bucket of sand, right? And I'm going to go and slam it on his head, right? What's that? That's vengeance, right? That's wrath, right? The immoderate, what do we say? Unreasonable desire to inflict evil upon somebody. I will return what was done to me, but amplified, right? And then what's he going to do? Well, he's going to go get, and do something worse. and then you see how it escalates, right? What did Jesus do? You know what he said? Don't resist somebody. You know, when someone hits you on one cheek, turn them to the other. In other words, don't escalate it. Let the evil that someone inflicts die with you. Absorb it. Take it. Doesn't mean be weak. Someone slaps you in the face, someone throws you sand in your face, you stand there and you stand back up and you take it. Now you've just exhausted his evil. Now you've shamed him, right? But I'm not going to escalate it, right? I'm not going to further it. That's kind of the idea. There's more to talk about that, but it's utterly centered on the self. Why? And ultimately becomes a burden that harms us more than it hurts the other. Is the rage and the anger that poisons every relationship, including our relationship with God. I mean, how are we supposed to burn with wrath toward another person, toward our neighbor, but then love God? You can't do it, right? Can't do it. And that's why it becomes poisonous to all of our relationships. And perhaps we ourselves have suffered that type of bitter resentment, the anger and all those things. It just burns us up, right? And you see how it destroys other people's lives, even the rest of their lives. They just can't they are so filled with rage and anger. Sometimes after a legitimately evil thing had been done to them, but they're so filled with bitterness, resentment, with wrath, that it poisons everything else, right? As we like to say, don't let another person's sin cause you to sin, right? Something to think about. What's the antidote? Is forgiveness. First of all, and you go, yeah, right, Father. Yeah, that's easy for you to say. Well, okay, and I know that. But how often do we ask for forgiveness of God? Right? In the Lord's Prayer, we condition the forgiveness we ask of God on the measure with which we forgive others. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. That means forgive us only to the extent that we forgive others. Holy moly. Is that what we're saying? Yeah, it is, right? Pay attention, by the way, during the Mass, of how many times we ask for mercy from God. If you pay attention, particularly Sunday Mass, you'll see how many times we ask God for mercy throughout the Mass, beginning, middle, and end. Really amazing. So, in this sense, how can I be asking mercy, forgiveness of God again and again and again, and then not seek to offer it to another? Right? Go to confession often. That's another one that'll help you. As you're going asking for forgiveness, you're more able to give it to others. And often this is not easy, so you need to pray for the grace to forgive. And there are some genuinely evil things that people have endured. We need to pray for the grace to forgive, not to let the sin of another cause us to sin. The wrathful in purgatory are basically made to sit in all of this big black smoke, right? So that they cannot see their neighbor to vent their wrath upon them, right? They just have to sit in the choking blackness of their own self without being able to exact vengeance on another, right? Moving on, sloth or acedia, sometimes called the noonday devil by the medieval. I read a book. It's called The Noonday Devil by the medieval monks, and they thought this was a real big one. So what is sloth? This is St. Thomas again. Sorrow in regard to spiritual good, or refusal to exert oneself to do the things necessary to attain salvation. Right? Wow. Right? I know what I got to do, but I'm just sad about doing it. Right? Refusal, I'm just not going to do it. Right? It's not the same as laziness and earthly things, right? This is a spiritual vice. And some have called this the deadliest of the seven, because with the others, you'll eventually crash and burn, right? If you're prideful, something's going to happen where you're just totally cut off and alone. Eventually, you're going to crash and burn and turn to God. and convert, hopefully. But sometimes with sloth, you'll just forever sit on the spiritual couch, right? You just won't get up and do the things needed for your salvation. It's a tough one. Why does it affect us? Well, relativism, the idea that it doesn't really matter. Relativism is that idea that, all religions, all faith, or no faith, doesn't matter. It's all the same, right? And so, this idea, this doesn't matter what I do or what I don't do. God doesn't care, any of that. Lack of faith, bad habits, sadness, no perceivable progress. All those are causes of sloth. Maybe the same reason we don't go to the gym, right? Because there's all those same reasons. I don't know. I don't want to do it. And we collapse in a heap of sad spiritual lethargy, right? What's the antidote? Ironically, by remembering, again, that we're dust, but beloved dust, right? Remember who you are and what your mission is. You're a beloved child of God, redeemed by Christ, baptized into his body. You look at that crucifix and say, he would have died if I were the only person who ever lived. His love for you is that deep. You were created to know, love, and serve God in this life in order to be happy with him in the next. He wants you to share his life, and he wants to share your life, to remember those things, right? John Cardinal Newman, about 150 years ago, famously wrote these words, and I think they're good ones to remember about our mission. God knows me and calls me by my name. He's created me to do him some definite service. He has committed some work to me which he has not committed to another. I have my mission. I have a part in this great work of his. I'm a link in a chain, a bond of connection with persons. He has not created me for nothing. I shall do good. I shall do his work. Right? In other words, I'll remember who I am and what my mission is. Right? Beautiful words. How do the slothful suffer in purgatory? This was a bit obscure. Actually, we're going to read this tomorrow. No, not tomorrow. At the visitation of the Lord, when it said after the Annunciation in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, it says that after Mary learned of Elizabeth, her cousin's pregnancy with John the Baptist, she went in haste to the hill country. In other words, she hurried. So the idea of the slothful in purgatory is that they're made to run constantly while saying this endlessly. Mary ran in haste to the hill country. So Mary was running, right? She wasn't slothful, in other words. She was moving. She was running. So they're made to say this endlessly and while they're running. Kind of obscure, but yeah. Number 5 is greed or avarice, right? What is greed? The immoderate, unreasonable desire for riches. Notice that there is a moderate and reasonable desire for material things. And notice how often the deadly sins have those two adjectives, immoderate and unreasonable, right? They're not reasonable, right, with our mind, right? And they're immoderate. So there is, in the case of greed, there is a moderate and a reasonable desire for material things. Sure there is. But when does it become immoderate or unreasonable? And I can't give you a hard and fast, it's this amount of money, or it's this big a property, or whatever it is, or this type of car. When does greed become immoderate or unreasonable? Well, when we begin to seek created things more than the creator of things, when they're more important to us, right? When we forget where all our gifts and possessions ultimately come from, when the desire for riches prevents us from seeing the needs of others and giving generously to satisfy them, right? When we have that attitude, no, I'm not giving my money to someone who, it's mine, that whole type of thing, right? That attitude of Scrooge again, right? I'm not giving my money, right? I had a foundational visit to Peru when I was in the seminary. We went on a little missionary trip down there for about a month, and I was in a little village called Villa El Salvador. It's a little south of Lima. And you never seen poverty like this. I mean, the way people were living in these little shacks and things, it was awful. And we were there, and we were doing various things for them. And one family invited us over for lunch one day. And, it was just very generous. I mean, in this little shack that they had, it was a dirt floor, corrugated metal roof, various little scrap pieces of wood for their walls and everything else. And we were like 12 people, and they invited us into their little house, their little shack, to feed us. Right? They were so grateful that we were there. And out of their poverty, they fed us. It was a simple meal, papa salawan kaina, as I recall, which I didn't like, but I ate it, of course, right? And when they offered seconds, oh, yes, please. I'm like, oh. But it's enough to make you weep that out of their poverty, they were generous, right? And to us who had plenty of means to go get our own food, but they wanted to express their gratitude and their love, and in the only way that they could, they fed us this simple meal. So it was beautiful, right? So that antidote is generosity, right? To store up for yourself treasure in heaven, right? As Jesus said, and to ask, what can I do to build up the kingdom? If that's what we're supposed to do in life, to some way. Not everyone's going to do it the same way, but in some way to build up the kingdom. And it's going to involve some type of generosity, not just with money, but with time, with talent, whatever it is, right? What can I do to build up the kingdom? To have a preferential option for the poor. That's such a big thing in Scripture. We see that God had a special love for those who were poor because they knew they were totally dependent upon him. And he lavished them with his grace and blessing. And that we could have the same attitude that God has. There's also that beautiful scene in, I think it's Mark chapter 12, chapter 11, of the widow's mite. The widow that put two little pennies in the temple treasury, you remember? In the midst of all of the wealthy dumping in huge sums of gold into the temple. And Jesus looked at her and he said, she gave more than all the rest. Not in terms of dollar value, but out of love and generosity, because that's all she had. She made a great act of love and faith to God by putting her last two pennies in the temple treasury, whereas all the other ones gave out of their excess. And so God recognized that generous love of that woman and praised it. Right? I would say this. To be generous is to give deliberately. And whether that means to various charities or whatever, or when the collection basket comes through, and instead of, oh, there's the basket, I don't know, I got $1 here. Yeah, okay, $2. No, if I may, humbly, an idea of a budget. And I'm going to say, I'm going to give this much to my church and this much to whatever charity. Give deliberately. I'm thinking. It's not going to catch me by surprise. I'm going to do this. And I'm going to make it, that helps us be more generous, right? How do the avaricious suffer in purgatory? Again, kind of graphic. They're staked to the ground and their arms are tied, right? So that they can't reach out and grab other possessions, right? So their hands are bound together, right? Isn't that something? We're getting close to the end. The last two, the carnal sins, gluttony. So gluttony is defined as, again, immoderate and unreasonable pleasure in food or drink. Now, there are, and I have to mention this, there are psychological and addictive issues here, which I'm going to leave to the professionals. Here we're in the spiritual realm as a spiritual vice, right? And we're going to walk a tight line here because we need food and drink to survive. And they're to be found in eating and drinking, right? Which is good, right? That's wonderful. As I like to say, we're Catholics, we're not Puritans, okay? It's good to have a wonderful meal and enjoy all these wonderful things. Before, praises God who for the plants that bring forth bread from the earth, that oil that makes us glad, and wine that cheers our hearts, right? These are in praise of God for all of these wonderful things that we can eat and drink, and it's very pleasurable. And nothing wrong with having a big meal, and having a big full stomach, and like my grandfather used to do, unbuckle his belt, after dinner and just kind of sit there and let it all. Wonderful, right? But, it can reach a point where it's too much, right? Similar to greed. An excessive desire for created things, which are good, food and drink, prevents us from remaining focused on our highest good, which is God, okay? The satisfaction that we receive from food and drink can become a substitute for God, right? For whom we ultimately hunger and thirst. And when we try to satisfy our infinite hunger for God with finite things, it never works. Right? So that Jesus said to the woman at the well in John 4. He says, everyone who drinks the water that I will give will never be thirsty. The water I will give will become a spring of water gushing up for eternal life. He says, I'm the one that can satisfy you. I'm the source, right? The antidote is what we call asceticism or fasting. That makes sense, right? What does that do? It helps us take control of our earthly appetites so that they do not control us, and helps us refocus on God, for whom we truly hunger. This is, by the way, why Catholics traditionally give up something for Lent. That says we're fasting from it. What does it mean to give up something? You notice we don't give up things during Lent because they're bad. I mean, if they're bad, we should always be giving them up, right? We give up something precisely because they're good, some food or pleasurable activity or something, right? Because they're good, that's why we give them up, right? Not because they're bad. If they're bad, you should be giving them up all the time, right? We give them up because they're good. But to give up an earthly good is to recognize that no earthly good can satisfy us. That the earthly goods have a tendency to blur our vision of our highest good, which is God. So giving them up helps us refocus, right? So even outside of Lent, fasting from pleasurable earthly things is a healthy and venerable practice, right? How do the gluttonous suffer in purgatory in Dante's fiction? Well, of course, they're made to starve. These emaciated people here. And what you don't see here, there are little fruits up on the tree, just out of reach. Right? You just can't get it. And their prayer is, "Oh Lord, open my lips." It's from one of the Psalms. Open my lips and my mouth shall declare your praise. In other words, open my lips, Lord, to speak your praise and not to cram food into it. All right? And I love that picture. And finally, the deadly sin of lust. Now, again, a line here, because it's not like pride or envy or wrath where it's a good thing and it's just been twisted. No. But in the case of this, it is. I mean, sexual pleasure is good. Some would say it's very good, right? It would in Catholic Puritans. Let me see if my It was created by God to be good and pleasurable. That's why he made it that way, right? And to lead to the purposes for which he created it, the procreation of children and the unity of the spouses. More on this later when we get to the sacrament of matrimony. So how do we define lust? Using another human being as a means to satisfy one's own sexual desire. Or another way, the objectification of another human person. Now, in any ethical realm, not just the sexual one, using another person as a means to an end is morally objectionable. In the realm of faith, it's a deadly sin, right? Notice again, the focus is always on the self, right? It's what I want. It's what I desire. I don't care about you as a human being, only what I can get from you, right? No openness to the other as a person made in the image and likeness of God and whom I should love, right? How do you love your neighbor when you're using them for sexual pleasure, right? That's lust, right? And I would add an addendum to this, if I may add on to what St. Thomas Aquinas, the doctor of the church, and has said, if I may add something to him. Lust is, as he said, using another human being as a means to satisfy one's own sexual desire, and I would add, even if the other person asks you to do so. And that's really, in essence, what pornography is. The person is asking you to objectify him or her. Or are they? Sometimes you wonder, are they being forced to do this? You hear about the stories of their trapped, their sex trafficking of women and all of these things, and they're forced to do these things and to make money. It's an awful, awful business. But even if they quote unquote ask you to do it, I still can't objectify another person. Still can't use another person, even if they ask me to do it. Right? Humble question. Does artificial birth control make it more likely or less likely that I will treat another person as a means to satisfy my own sexual desire? Said another way, does artificial birth control make me more likely or less likely to treat the other person and his or her body with reverence and respect? Food for thought. We'll return to that when we get to the sacrament of matrimony as well. Start to see where the church has problems with these things, right? So the antidote, of course, is chastity. Moral uprightness in matters of sex, the absolute respect for the other as a human being, the complete refusal, therefore, to use that person as a means to an end, right? That's love of neighbor. I won't do that to you, right? Even if you don't know them, even if they're asking you to do it, I won't do that, right? Like any of the passions, lust can be controlled, right? We're not animals, right? We have the ability, not without God's help, to control our passions, our glances, our thoughts, our conversations, our actions, right? Practice what we call in the church custody of the eyes, right? You see the pretty girl coming down the beach, you look at the sand, okay, until she passes, right? Why? You don't need that image going on in your head, right? Nothing good's going to come of that, right? Married, single, doesn't matter, right? Doesn't matter. Hey, look at the sand. Isn't that nice? Oh, look at that. There's a seashell. All right, yeah, isn't that nice? All right. And parents, exercise. I'm sorry, but the kids don't. You got to do this. Exercise complete control over your kids' internet access. Someone asked me, well, my opinion on when I thought their son, should give him a cell phone. I said, as soon as you want him to look up pornography online, that's when you should give him a cell phone. Right? Believe me, it is so easy. And these kids, oh my goodness, the way that they're getting so confused and everything. You got to complete absolute control over their internet access, and you got to stay up with it too, because there's ways they know ways to get around it that we don't. So how do the lustful, again in Dante's Purgatory, how do they suffer in purgatory? They're made to run through flames, right? As if to say, you thought you were on fire before, right? Yeah, you really are, right? And I'll throw this in, since we're on Dante. This is the moment when purgatory ends. And as we get toward that part of the book, Dante hears this glorious sound of trumpets and the singing of angels, Gloria and Hallelujahs, right? And he asks, well, what is that? He says, well, that's the soul of one who has been purged of all his sins, right? And the angels come down and they grab hold of him and carry him up to heaven to all the glorious sound of the angels singing and the choirs and all of this. And this is a sign of the angels carrying this now blessed woman up to the gates of heaven. Right? So those are the 7 deadly sins. So next week we're going to do the 10 Commandments. That's a big one. Next Thursday, that's a week from Thursday, February 11th at 7 p.m., we're going to start our final little push here on our series called The Search. That's going to beautifully sum up everything that we've been talking about. You're going to see how much of what we've talked about kind of plays in to this video series. Catechumens, you're non-baptized. Remember, Sunday, February 21st. That's one of your days. We're going to do the rite of sending at the 9:30 Mass and the rite of election at the 3 p.m. Mass over at St. Bonaventure. I'll be in contact with you this week, or Victoria will. There's Victoria. Say hi, Victoria. She'll be in contact with you for any, just to confirm those things and get from you any information that we need. And remember that your big day is the Easter Vigil, April 3rd this year at 8 p.m. That's a Saturday. And candidates, everyone else, your big day is Easter Sunday, April 4th this year at the 9:30 Mass. So don't forget that. Please don't tell me, I'm not going to make it, Father. I got to go to the beach that day. No. That's the day, right? Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning.